So before I begin the next section, even before we kind of reiterate what we talked about in the previous section, I wanted to respond to a couple of things that were just said. When we talk about love, I think it's important that we realize that the love that we're called to as Christians is very radical. It's not the love that we hear about in the world today. And it's so radical, it almost seems crazy. It's a crazy kind of love that seems almost impossible to accomplish. And an example I often give when I talk about this is, if we really were to love like Christ loved, the way that Christ loves us, in our own unique and unrepeatable way, we would work our way towards salvation if that's something that we could do. That's not our belief about salvation, that it's something we can earn. But if we could, we would earn it and give it to someone else. And not just anybody else, not just the person we love the most. We would earn our salvation and give it to Hitler. We would earn our salvation and give it to Stalin. We would earn our salvation and give it to the person who's on death row. These are the radical types of love that we're talking about. Now again, we don't earn our salvation. That's not our perspective. It's not like we think that we can do something and then get saved or something along those lines. But we realize that ultimately all of this isn't about that. It's not about salvation. And there's a beautiful expression about the types of faithful people in the world. And it's attributed sometimes to certain saints, but it actually comes from a Sufi mystic named Rumi. He's a poet. I recommend reading. He has beautiful poetry about love. I think you should all get a chance to. There's a book called The Big Red Book or something like that, but read Rumi. He's amazing. He is from a different religious tradition, but he's speaking about stuff that is very, very orthodox in its orientation. Rumi, R-U-M-I. It's just amazing. And one of the things that Rumi says is that there are three types of faithful people. People that follow after God and do things accordingly. And the first group are those who do it to avoid hell. They do it to avoid punishment. So in this context, they love other people because they're commanded to do it, because if they don't, they're going to go to hell. The second group are those people that do it so they get into heaven. There are those people that do it so that they earn their end, pie in the sky, end of life placement in the beautiful paradise. And he says, those are okay. Those are interesting ways. We kind of progress through them as we continue our spiritual life, as we become disciplined and less selfish. And then he goes, the third one, this is what he actually says, the third one is those who simply love God. And that's enough. They don't need anything else. They're not doing it for any reward, any avoidance of punishment. They're doing it for no other reason than they love God. And you can extrapolate from that, in that love for God that they cultivate, they're also loving their neighbor. And the second point I want to make before I continue this thought and then before I start my talk is that the love that we're called to is not just love for other people. We're called to love the entire creation as much as we love God. We're to love God more than anything, but we're called to love everything as much as we love God. But looking at the perspective again that God is above everything, we love God to our absolute fullest ability with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then we love our neighbor as ourselves. But this is also where the theology that we often hear in the Orthodox Church about ecology, theology and ecology, where our patriarch is called the Green Patriarch, and he calls it a sin to destroy the world around us, the physical world. And so this radical love that we're called to is a radical love, radical self-sacrifice, kind of like we saw Batman do, towards everything in creation. People, the animals, the environment, everything. We're supposed to radically love the world as God loves the world, as God loves his creation. And so returning to that question about where we stand in relationship to those three ways that we can do what we're supposed to do, that we can be disciplined. It's a matter of perspective. And Father and I were talking a little bit about how perspective is very important in our spiritual lives. And so the perspective of the first one is a perspective of avoiding punishment. The perspective of the second one is trying to get a reward. And the perspective of the third one is the one that we're talking about, It's love. For no other reason than it's good to love. God is good, and it's good to love God. And because we love God, we love God's creation, because God loves his creation. And it's just simple as that. And so the example that I often use is when we look in the scriptures for examples of what judgment really is. We see in Matthew 25 the parable of the sheep and the goats. And in that we kind of see that we're not judged by any of the practices we do, liturgy, all these practices that we're going to talk about towards the end of this next talk. But we're judged whether or not we loved. And the judgment isn't something that's like bestowed upon us, but it's something that's natural to what we're doing. Remember what Bruce Wayne said, or Batman said to Rachel, how it's not who I am underneath, it's what I do that defines me. Again, we are moving from the idea of love as an action to love as something that we are. And this parable speaks to that. Because when the sheep and the goat are asked about, or told that where they're going based on how they live their lives, neither group realized they were doing it, even the loving ones. The ones that did what they were supposed to do said to Christ on the judgment seat, when did we do this? When did we take care of you when you were sick or in prison, did we visit you, or when you were hungry or thirsty or naked? When did we do those things? And he says, when you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. But they had cultivated a worldview of love, those people, so internally. They had become loved so perfectly that they weren't acting because of that love in the sense that they were trying. They were acting out of that love because it's who they were and how they were, and that's all they could do. And this is what these practices, this struggle, this discipline that we're talking about, this avoidance of distraction is about. And we'll talk more about how difficult that is in this talk. But that's why I really wanted to stress that. We're cultivating a worldview of love that's radically different than the worldview of love that we hear about in the world today. Because it's either a worldview of selfishness or self-love, or even when we talk about love, a lot of people say they love someone, but really they're saying, I love how that person makes me feel. It's not something that's outwardly directed. It's not something about that person as they are unique and unrepeatable images of God. It's something about how that person relates to you. So with that said, this is where we step into our next topic. And it's really about the nitty-gritty of how we go about doing it. Now, I said in the last session how Rachel slapping Bruce several more times than she actually did in the movie speaks to the idea of the radical moment when we think we're not doing really what we're supposed to do. Maybe we're a little more selfish than we want to be. Maybe our initial response isn't of love. It's of selfishness. And at that moment, we begin to say, okay, we're going to struggle. We're going to do the exercises, the ascesis, the exercise, the discipline. We're going to go to the spiritual gym. We're going to do spiritual CrossFit. Like I said, I'm not going to do physical CrossFit, but spiritual CrossFit I might be more inclined to do. You can do it with a book, and that's what I like. So returning to our theme, discipline and distraction again, this is what we're talking about. So once we've made the decision to live a life of love, and that's where we want to orient ourselves, we have to actually start disciplining ourselves towards that end. And the disciplined actions that we do, all of the things that the church gives us and prescribes, literally are there to teach us to love. We don't go to confession. We don't go to the services simply to go, like it's a checklist. They actually do something to us. They slowly trim away everything that makes us selfish, and all we're left with is loving being love. And that's what the whole life of the Orthodox Church is about. Everything that you say that you're all disciplined, you want to be more disciplined and avoid distraction in, all of the things that we do in the Orthodox Church are towards that end. This cessation of self-love, of selfishness, of philautia, that word I talked about, and the cultivation of agape, or love. And as we love the other, and we discipline ourselves spiritually, our love actually grows exponentially. But it doesn't mean that it's easy. There's struggles along the way. And we'll see that in our next clip.
Not as serious as yours, I fear. Let's not stand on ceremony here. Mr. Wayne. Patience cost you your strength. Victory has defeated you. And deception, powerful agents to the uninitiated. But we are initiated, aren't we, Bruce? Members of the League of Shadows. And you betrayed us.
Yes, you rescued Hurricane by a gang of psychopaths.
I am the League of Shadows. I'm here to fulfill Razagul's destiny. You fight like a younger man, with nothing held back. Admirable, but mistaken. Darkness is your ally. You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't see the light until I was already a man. By then it was nothing to me but blinding. The shadows betray you because they belong to me. I will show you where I have made my home while preparing to bring justice. Then I will break you. Your precious armor, gratefully accepted. We will need it. First, your spirit. Oh, your body.
Sometimes when we decide that we're going to start this fight, this disciplined action, this movement away from selfishness and into love, it can be like fighting Bane. It can seem like a heck of a big challenge, and we can give a lot to it at the very beginning, and it may not happen for us right away, and that's important to note. This process is not something that happens instantaneously. Our culture kind of makes us think that we can resolve things in a 22-minute sitcom. That's not how the spiritual life is. There's not a peak moment within like a short amount of time where resolution happens. We're cultivating a disciplined life to carry us throughout life. It's not something that we always we earn once and for all. Even in the understanding of the stages of spiritual life that we have in the Orthodox Church, where there's 3 stages, and you kind of move from one to the other. The first stage is discipline in its kind of worldview or in its motivations, and it's called purification or praxis, and it's the actual nitty-gritty of trying to overcome the passions, the distractions in life. But what's understood in the ascetical tradition, the tradition of self-sacrifice towards love, is that you're always doing the process. You never stop doing the process. And you may start fighting Bane. It may be very difficult, and you may end up in very compromising situations.
You don't fear death. You welcome it. Your punishment must be more severe. Torture. Yes. But not of your body. Of your soul. Home. Where live the truth about despair. As will you. There's a reason why this prison is the worst hell on earth. Hope. Every man who was rotted here over the centuries has looked up to the light and imagined climbing to freedom. So easy. So simple. And like shipwrecked men turning to seawater from uncontrollable thirst. Many have died trying. And learned here that there can be no true despair without hope. So, as I terrorize Gotham, I will feed its people hope to poison their souls. I will let them believe that they can survive so that you can watch them clambering over each other to stay in the sun. You can watch me torture an entire city. And then when you truly understood the depth of your failure, we will fulfill Basilico's destiny. We will destroy Gotham. And then, when it is done, and Gotham is ashes, then you have my permission to die.
Sometimes the process of fighting Bane leads us to the brink of despair. To think that there's really nothing I can do. Like, it may seem like I have all these things around me. Maybe the banes of our lives aren't something as difficult as what Batman is going through. Again, I use extremes to like really emphasize the point, but it could be something more simple than that. Simply choosing whether or not on Sunday morning to get up to go to church. Whether or not when you're walking down the street, you see a homeless person on the street, to actually stop and talk to them. And not just give them something, but to really encounter them as someone who is someone made in the image and likeness of God. And it may be a struggle at first, and again, it may bring us to the brink of despair. But what's different about Orthodoxy, or what Orthodoxy gives us, is an avenue through which we can fight against this despair, fight against this kind of inertia, this thought that we can't really do it because it seems so overwhelming. But what we have is simple practices. Little by little, there are things that we can do to cultivate love. And it doesn't become necessarily easier right off the bat, but it becomes more second nature to us. We're actually first nature if we really think about it. We become more ourselves, and we start acting in a way, we start engaging the world as our true selves, ourselves who love. And so there is a process, and there is a struggle that takes place.
Someone that died here.
Yeah. Constant evidence.
Sometimes we fall and have to try again.
Body makes the joke. Survivor is speaking. I saw it. My soul is afraid to escape with my body. Fear. That's why you feel. No, I'm not afraid. I'm angry.
Sometimes we fail again.
Do not fear death. I think this makes you strong. It makes you weak. Why? How can you move faster than possible? Fight longer than possible? Without the most powerful impulse of the spirit. The fear of death. I fear death. I fear dying here. While my city burns. There's no there safe. Your leg decline. As the child is. Without the home. Then fear will find you again. Supplies for your journey. Is that me? Rise.
And when love is the motivation, we can do amazing things, things that we didn't think possible. And love not only is the motivation, but our goal. So it's this kind of dual process by which we're not only seeking it, but it's also what's giving us strength to continue. So we're moving towards it as it's kind of pushing us, not away from it, but like pushing us out into the world. So we don't have to acquire love all off the bat, like right off the bat, and then start acting. We can start acting in the process, little by little sacrifices, willingness to toss down the rope, knowing that they didn't make the climb, but you did. But it doesn't mean that they don't deserve to get out. Little things, acts of love. So here's our good friend, St. Justin again. Again, he's one of my favorites. He's just such a beautifully eloquent speaker. There's a number of books out that you can find. If you want to know more about him, feel free to ask. And as we cultivate love, again, we're moving oriented towards love of God, but as I've already said, love for Christ overflows into love for one's neighbor and also the world around us. for truth, love of holiness, for the world, for purity, for everything divine, for everything deathless and eternal. All these forms of love are natural manifestations of our love for Christ. Christ is the God-man, and love for him always means love for God and for man. When we love Christ God, we also love all that is divine, immortal, and Christ-like in people. We can truly love people if we do not. We can't truly love people if we do not love them for the sake of these causes. Any other love is pseudo-love, which is easily changed into lovelessness and hatredness towards people. True love for man comes from love for God, and love for God grows in accordance with keeping of his commandments. St. Justin. So as I said, we're cultivating this worldview, this way of thinking, the way of engaging the world, the way of seeing reality, which really isn't any different than what we should be doing. It's really just us coming to terms with the fact, or us stripping away the things that prevent us from seeing reality as it really is. And so we do these discipline steps, we climb out of the pit, so to speak, of our distractions, and we pretty soon after start to feel the effects of love. We're more open to understanding other people. We don't see them with hate or distrust. We see them with love. And we have more sympathy for them. And it's important that we kind of parse that word out, sympathia, sympathy. Remember I said passions were called the pathi. And so sympathy means to suffer with someone. To realize that also, like, we know what people are going through. How can we be angry with someone when we know the struggles that life have? How can you really judge someone for everything they do that may not be so great to you? Again, our self-centeredness. When you know exactly what life is like, how distracting it can be, how many awful things can happen. And so this is what this love allows us to do. It allows us to interpret the world around us. And we interpret it in a manner that's loving, in a manner that's Christ-centered, in a manner that will allow for the change of the world around us into the kingdom of heaven, here and now. And that leads to self-sacrifice.
The midtown tunnel's blocked by debris, but the cannons have enough firepower to make a path for people. Wait until the fighting begins.
You can wage a war and say you're stuck up girlfriend?
Start it in front.
I got it.
We have 45 minutes to save this city.
No, I've got 45 minutes to get clear of the blast radius because you don't stand a chance against these guys.
With your help, I might.
I'll open that tunnel, then I'm gone.
There's more to you than that.
Sorry to keep letting you down. Come with me. Save yourself. You don't owe these people anymore. You've given them everything.
Not everything. Not yet.
Not everything, not yet. If you saw that, if you looked at where Bruce Wayne was at the very beginning, that selfish, self-centered, distracted young man, to the point where he's asked the question, come with me, save yourself. Maybe that young Bruce Wayne might have just left, might have only thought of himself. But the training, the discipline, the movement, the exercise, all of that led him to be able to say, not everything, not yet. And so this is the real test of our love, is a willingness to be completely self-emptying. And we see this line in the image of Christ crucified, which is the marker for us as Orthodox Christians of where true love takes us. It doesn't take us to romantic dinners or walks on the beach or pina coladas or whatever you want. It leads us to the cross. And not maybe always a physical cross. Sometimes it's an emotional cross. Sometimes it's a spiritual cross. But it's definitely a self-sacrifice. It's a dying to ourselves for the sake of the other. And we know that Christ's words are this, that greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. And it doesn't have to be actually laying down your life. It doesn't have to be dying for the other physically. But it certainly does daily mean to deny ourselves, to pick up our cross, to follow Christ, and to be willing to sacrifice to whatever extent we're called to. And that's the worldview we start to engage the world with. And then when we do that, amazing things can happen, and sometimes difficult choices have to be made.
What are you doing? I can get it out over the bay.
Set to fly out over the water with a jet?
No autopilot.
You're not anywhere good at anything. But you came back here.
So did you.
Because we're both suckers.
I never cared who you were. You were right. But shouldn't the people know the hero who saved them? Hero can be anyone. Even a man doing something simple. And reassuring is putting a coat around a young boy's shoulders. To let him know the world and Bruce Wayne. Okay, you too.
That's Batman!
That's detonation. It's on over the bay. It's clear to see.
Look familiar, George? I told George last night I would like a portion of my talk, and for those of you who don't know, this film one film in the series was filmed in Pittsburgh, so you probably know those bridges pretty well.
I've driven over it once or twice.
Yeah. So again, I'm not going to say what happens. For those of you who've seen the movie, you know where that leads to, but it could have ended just there, because ultimately that's what life's all about. It's about living for the other completely, loving so much that you think not of yourself, but immediately respond in love for the other. A willingness to fly out with a nuclear bomb over the harbor, knowing that you probably have no means of escape. We're not all going to be called to do that, but little things in life, like stopping and talking to someone on the street, or picking up your garbage when you're walking, or picking up other people's garbage. All of those things are signs of love. And they should become second nature as you go through this process, as you become more disciplined in your striving towards love. So there's a lot of things that we need to talk about the practical aspects of cultivating this love. And this is where the practical theologian in me comes out. Love is the fruit of prayer. Patiently abiding in prayer signifies man's renunciation of himself. Therefore, the self-denial of the soul turns into love for God. This is Saint Isaac the Syrian. He's a beautiful saint. If you get a chance to read him, you can always find him. If any of you come to be friends with me on Facebook, a lot of times I'm posting things from him. He's just so beautifully eloquent in his understanding of love for God and love for our fellow human beings and the world around us. But he's saying here that love is the fruit of prayer. And I think you should write that down. Love is the fruit of prayer. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what prayer means in relationship to discipline, but that's a very important line. This next saint is another one of my favorites, and I'm contemplating using him as an example for my dissertation, just because he's so profoundly influenced many of the theologians of this past century and the contemporary century. His name is Saint Silouan the Athonite. He lived in the late 1800s and up until the mid 1900s. So he's a very recent saint. Lived on Mount Athos. He lived at the monastery of Saint Panteleimon on Mount Athos, and he was a Russian, but he lived on Mount Athos at the Russian monastery. And I had the rich blessing this summer of actually venerating his relics. I went to Mount Athos for a couple stays over the summer, and I actually got to venerate his skull, which seems a little morbid for those of us who aren't familiar with the tradition of relics, but for me it was an opportunity to actually enter into the presence of someone who I hold so dear, Saint Silouan. And Saint Silouan writes that whoever has known the love of God loves the whole world and never murmurs against his fate. For the burden of the sorrow for the sake of God gains eternal joy. Remember I said there's that response that we might have when we're first asked to do something, when we're in that mode of self-love or that selfishness. And then I say, but when we're in the mode of love, there's no murmuring. There's just an automatic movement towards love. And that's what St. Silouan is saying here. When we know God's love through prayer, through our life in Christ, when things are asked of us where we have to maybe do something that's not comfortable, so to speak, or not what we really want to do necessarily, or would be probably the most pleasant experience for us, or even just doing something as simple as getting off the couch and like I live with my grandparents, and something like Friday morning before I had to come here, I walked upstairs and my yaya asked me to go to the grocery store. I'm like, I'm supposed to be leaving now to head up for the retreat. And she goes, oh, never mind. I'm like, God, cut me to the heart, yaya. Okay, so I went to the grocery store. But anyway, so she, just like the initial response, even though I try to cultivate this spirit of love, my initial response was, it's interrupting my plans. But even if that happens at first, even if we're not so quick to just do things out of love or carry that box without thinking that someone's struggling with without them asking us, even if it doesn't happen initially, even the process of coming to the realization that, okay, maybe that initial response wasn't the right one. I should live more lovingly. That's what this worldview is trying to cultivate in us. And so how do we do it? Practical steps towards learning to love. Reading the scriptures and other edifying texts as a daily practice for discipline. How many of us read the scriptures daily? How many of us know that there's an app for that? Who has an Android or an iPhone? Every one of you can download the free version if you want, or if you want to support the Archdiocese, there's a nicer version with more things like prayers and stuff like that. But it's the Daily Readings app from the Archdiocese, from the Go Arch website. And you can use that, and it gives you the readings of the day, the saints of the day, and you can also get it sent to your email. So like first thing actually comes at like midnight, so you can even read it the night before and meditate on it before you go to bed, if you're up until midnight like I am studying. You can read it when you first wake up in the morning, and it can set the mood, the tone for the rest of the day. Father was telling me about this practice that he does of just thanking God for the very first breath that we take when we wake up, and having things like that shape our day. But having a disciplined practice of reading the scriptures. Now, A nice thing to do is set up a Bible reading plan. The Archdiocese had this really wonderful thing. I think there's a Facebook group where you read the Bible in a year. And you can do that. You can set up reading plans where you read the New Testament in a certain amount of time, or you read a little bit from the Old Testament and a little bit of the New Testament. I'm not saying that you have to try to read the Bible in a year, but if you do this daily reading cycle of the Orthodox Church through the daily readings app or the email, you'll actually read most of the Bible, with the exception of Revelation and a few other texts. But if you do that, you'll read most of the Bible in a year, and it's so edifying and it's so transformative in our lives because it teaches us, it gives us real insight in how to live and love, and especially the words of Christ and the apostles teach us that. And talk to your spiritual father or parish priest about good spiritual books to read. If you want, I am a little bit. I was talking about the Father about how I boast in my weaknesses. One of them is coffee. The other one is hearing the sound of my own voice and liking it. And then the third one is books. I love books. So if you ever want to get a good recommendation for a spiritual text, feel free to reach out to me or your parish priests or your spiritual fathers. And I say spiritual fathers, I think it's very important that that's something you also cultivate. Because we understand our lives in terms of relationships, a spiritual father isn't like someone that you like to impose rules on you or something like that. A spiritual father is a beautiful relationship you can form, or a spiritual mother. There's those of you who live on Long Island, there's the beautiful monastery there. And the abbess there is a beautiful woman with a lot of spiritual insight. And so you can have these beautiful relationships with people that may be a little further along than you, or at least have struggled a little bit longer than you have in cultivating love. And they can give you good practices, texts, things to read. But the important thing is to find regular time during the day to do this, so you can maintain the discipline. The next one is prayer. We talked a little bit about that there's different types of prayer. When I talk about here prayer, I'm talking about the daily practice of personal prayer. And so a good thing to do is, again, with your spiritual father, is to cultivate a prayer rule. Find times during the day when you consistently pray. It could be the thanking God for that first breath when you wake up, making the sign of the cross as you put your feet on the floor and saying the Lord's Prayer. Or it could be something a little more disciplined than that. I was telling Father about a book that I have on my shelf that's called How to Live a Holy Life. And it's really interesting because it starts the morning off by saying doing those things like those initial steps, but then it says don't do your morning prayers until you've showered and gotten dressed, because you're standing before the Lord. You should be dressed before you do that, and you shouldn't do it in your PJs. Not that it really matters what you're wearing, but it's this idea that like it becomes a part of your routine, and in becoming part of your routine, it becomes easier to do, and the fruit of that is love. The fruit of doing these things is love. Another thing to learn about is learning about silence or hesychasm. This is a very important tradition in the East, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it's the practice of the prayer of the heart, or the Jesus prayer. And how many of you have heard of the Jesus prayer? What's the Jesus prayer?
Lord Jesus Christ and God,
Nice and loud.
Lord Jesus Christ and God, and
Yeah. It's a beautiful prayer that goes back to the time of the Christian desert, monks and nuns, the ascetics of the desert, and outside of Egypt and in Palestine, and essentially it's a short prayer that you do, which makes it easy to focus on. And what's beautiful about the practice of prayer of the heart and hesychasm, or stillness as it's called in Orthodoxy, or as it's translated, is eventually words cease, and you literally just sit in the presence of the Lord. And in that presence, much like when you're with someone you really love, and you don't have to talk, you just are with that person, and you can feel yourself growing closer to them, and you're not saying anything, you're not doing anything, you just are existing with them. And in doing that, you can cultivate love. And that's another thing that we have in our practice, our tool belt. And again, the most important thing is sticking to it. Fasting. Who here likes fasting? You don't have to say you do. Who here likes to do it?
I like how I feel after the initial doing it.
Okay. It's difficult, right? It's not an easy thing. How many of you know Telly Papa Nicolau, who's at Fordham? Telly's an amazing, amazing guy. And I heard him give a talk about fasting and the things that we do in Orthodoxy and why we do them. And when he talked about fasting, he said something very beautiful. So I want to attribute it to him because it's not from me. Give credit where it's due. He said that what's so amazing about fasting is when we link something like eating that we have to do every day to survive with the memory of Christ, it becomes a means of growing closer to him. And even when we're not fasting, we remember that we're not fasting because we know there are days when we are fasting. So on days like that aren't Wednesday and Friday every week when we're not fasting, we remember, oh, it's not Wednesday or Friday, I can have that hamburger because you're here, hamburger. I don't know if you all know that, but it's in the packet. This is where the first hamburger was made. So you can have that hamburger on certain days because we're not fasting, and we fast because we want to grow closer to Christ because it's a good discipline. Because if I can deny myself meat, dairy, oil, fish, wine on those days when I have to, well, maybe it's a little bit easier for me to deny myself when something more difficult comes along, like sacrificing for my neighbor, or not getting angry, or going to the grocery store for yeah. Maybe it's a little bit easier because I've cultivated that practice of fasting and denying myself on a simple, easy way to do. A good way to, so we have to be attentive to the fasting periods throughout the year. So there's the Great Fast right before Lent, which it's actually longer than 40 days. We calculate differently than the Western Church, so we're actually fasting for quite a bit longer. There's also the fasting period for the Apostles' Fast, which most people don't adhere to, and it's not always there because sometimes because of where Pentecost falls, we don't actually have to do it. Then there's the Panagias Fast, the 15 days in August, and then there's the 40 days right before Christmas, where we fast for those 40 days. And those are the consistent periods of the church. Be attentive to them. In addition to that, there are days, every Wednesday and every Friday is a strict fast day. There are certain feast days throughout the year, like the beheading of St. John the Baptist, Tu Stavru, the feast day of the elevation of the Holy Cross. That's also a strict fast day. So there's a few other days that are strict fast days, and then there are days like the Wednesday and Friday after Pascha, and the Wednesday and Friday after Christmas are non-fasting days. There are days when we can have fish and not have fish, but again, it's all of these things are just to be attentive to something to remind us of something greater than the actual fasting itself. We're not fasting for fasting, we're fasting because it helps us cultivate love, and it helps us cultivate love because it keeps in mind that relationship with Christ. Again, Wednesday and Friday, fast in preparation for the sacraments according to the instructions of your spiritual father. So if your spiritual father says, don't eat meat, you can't eat meat the Saturday before you receive. Again, I'm not going to impose any practices, but you just kind of follow the teachings of your spiritual father is the best way to do it. But fast before the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. So that means usually for most spiritual fathers that I've heard, it's after midnight on the night before receiving, up until you receive. And then that leads us to the next thing, which is the central thing. And I want to really emphasize this, and I didn't place it at the beginning, but this has central focus. And that's living a sacramental life in community. And I want to stress two aspects of that. Living the sacramental life itself and living it in community. If everything is about love and about moving away from selfishness, it's also about moving away from individualism. And even when we receive the sacraments, it's an act of community. And that's what's important about it. And the community in which we receive these sacraments becomes our strength as we begin to more faithfully love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. So we have to regularly participate in these sacraments. Come to the church regularly on Sunday. Receive the Eucharist as often as you can in accordance with the teachings of your spiritual father. Come to the other services to which you are able. If there's a weekday service, I know that they do weekday services here at this little chapel. Anytime there's a feast day throughout the year, there might be a Vesper service. If there are other parishes in the area that are celebrating their feast day, you might want to go to Vesper service on that night, or liturgy the next day if it's early enough before work or school. Ask to receive the sacrament of reconciliation or confession. A lot of times this is one that's difficult for us to think about doing. It's tough to talk about ourselves. It's tough when we think about the banes in our life, to want to have to say it to another person. But I always like to look at the Orthodox spirituality as a science of spiritual medicine more than a set of rules. And by that I mean that when we're talking about sin and the passions and our distractions, we're talking about spiritual illness. We're not talking about a moral code that we're breaking. And we all know that when we're sick, we need healing. And we need to go a lot of times to a physician to do that. And so our spiritual father or father confessor or spiritual mother, they're people who've kind of learned this science of spiritual medicine well. And they're like our primary care physicians. They know our charts. They know what's wrong with us, what we struggle with, where we need help. And so when we go to confession, we're not like unloading a whole bunch of moral infractions. We're just letting the priest know our illnesses, and he's going to help us heal ourselves or help us allow Christ to heal us through the practices that we do. So he'll give us more practices to overcome these possibly. But again, it's not in judgment. It's not that you're confessing to the priest. The priest is just there to give you advice, to help you out, to let you know the best ways to overcome these things that are distracting us. And then in addition to the community sacramentally, we also have to look at what the community is doing outside of the sacramental life of the church, which stems from the sacramental life, this life of love and communion with God. But there's a lot going on in the church. There's retreats on Saturdays with guys from Boston. There's camps that you can participate in as staff. There's the Loptokos, and there's other outreach ministries. You can decide that, you know what, I really like what John said about ecology and theology. I want to start a recycling program. I want to start a park cleaning project, and doing it as an Orthodox Christian. And what's beautiful about Orthodoxy is the spiritual practices of the church, the things that we do, the disciplines that we have, aren't limited by any boundaries because they're rooted in love. And every loving action done in imitation of Christ becomes a spiritual practice, becomes a practice of the Orthodox Church. And basically, every time you move in the world in love, you're bringing Christ and the kingdom of heaven into the world around you. And so it can be something as simple as how you interact with people at school, or it can be something more constructive, like the ways in which you actually do outreach projects or environmental projects or anything like that. And serving others. I know that there's soup kitchens around. They don't have to be Orthodox soup kitchens. They don't have to be run by Orthodox churches. There's a million things you can do. You can go out and serve the homeless. You can go visit people in the nursing home. I'm sure Father has an abundance of people at any of your parishes where you're from that are shut-ins and would just love to have someone come talk to them. I did my hospital ministry in hospice. It takes a little bit of training, but there's a beautiful thing being with people as they're entering into the final stages of life. And so there's a million things that we can do in service of other people. And in the fact that we're serving the other people, it's automatically a service of love. And it's a movement away from selfishness. I'm done offering my perspective. I want to hear what you have to say. You all have lived your life in the church in various degrees for various lengths of time. What do you do? What are your disciplined actions now that we're perceiving discipline of distraction through a fight against selfishness and a cultivation of love? What are you going to do? It was semi-rhetorical, but you can answer.
I used to go to the Hellenic College conference.
Okay.
And one of the things I took away from there was when we broke up into small groups, there was a girl who said that as part of her ministry, she would walk through her dorm and say the Jesus prayer, silently to herself for everyone in the building. And so I like to do that at my work or in general in nothing.
She was saying that at college conference, she heard from someone in a small group that she would say the Jesus prayer through her dorm as a means of almost sanctifying the space. And so the idea would be that we can do that anywhere, and we can do that in any context. If we make that place a place of prayer, we make it an ecclesia, a church. Because the church isn't limited by the boundaries of the building, because the church is actually the people. And any movement in prayer, in love, becomes a movement of the church. And so that's a very beautiful practice that you can do. And it's something that's not very difficult at all. I don't know how many times that I'm stuck in traffic and I'm praying the Jesus prayer. One, because I'm from Boston and it's terrifying being on the road. And two, because it's I'm really thinking that's doing something for the world. It's making that little space, my little Honda Accord, the kingdom of heaven, and the people around me. Hopefully, they're having an experience of that.
Actually, now that you say that, I have a long commute on the Merritt Parkway, which is very narrow, and there are oftentimes cars pulled over. And every time I see a car, I do my cross, and I don't know if it's because I'm scared that will be me, because just the chances of how often I'm on the road, at some point something's going to happen, I'm going to be pulled over. But I think that now I should take that more as like a thinking moment, that I realize, okay, that could be me, and I'm grateful that it's not, but I'm also thinking of that person and hoping that they're okay. Maybe they just, need to make a phone call, or they're lost, or they're realizing that they're a truck and they shouldn't be on Merit.
Right. And it becomes second nature too.
Cars are really...
Yeah. How much time do we spend in our cars? Maybe not the college students so much, but trust me, you will be, especially in this commuting society that we have. Another thing that, like along those lines, is every time I see an ambulance with its lights flashing, I do, and I go to school right by hospitals, so it happens a lot. And also like little things, like I think I was talking to some of you the other night. Like Thursday, I was leaving work and I was leaving school, and I went a different way than I usually do, and I got stuck at a light, and there was a gentleman asking for money on the side of the road. And it's usually my habit, if I have something to give it to them, and I don't always have cash on me, but when I do, I give. But now it's become second nature that I don't just give. I always ask the person how they're doing, shake their hand, have a little conversation with them until the light changes or whatever context I'm in. And so the guy's name was Tito, and then he asked me my name. I went, well, Jonathan. And then we had this whole conversation about how Jonathan is a biblical name, and he's the friend of David. And so, like, just stopping on the side of the road got us talking about the Bible and got us talking about Christ. Not only did we each have an encounter of Christ, me with Tito on the street and Tito with me, both of us encountered Christ in the face of the other. We also started talking about something that's Christ-centered, the Scripture. And again, that's not an opportunity for me to toot my own horn. It's just to give you examples of how simple actions and taking advantage of the paths that God laid before you. Because the only reason Tito and I had that conversation was because I went a way that I usually don't go, and so I take that as God put me there. God wanted me to talk to Tito, and Tito said, "I'm going to try to remember your name." I meet a lot of different people, but I made it so that I would remember Tito's name. Because Tito is now part of who I am. My identity is bound up in Tito, because every person that I interact with, each and every one of you, are now imprinted on my identity. I am who I am now because I have met each and every one of you. And that idea of love, that idea of the other creating our identity, is a very Christian understanding, and that's something that we need to cultivate. Maybe in the small groups you guys can talk more about active ways that you can start to live out these practices, or what discipline practices you can do towards love. Do you have any questions for me before we do that? Anything about what I said? Is there anything that you just outright disagree with and you think I should never have said? Or anyone want to stone me? It's happened before. Okay. Thank you so much for listening.